Joining Chair McCormick Lee.
Present.
Member McIntosh just called me and will be joining momentarily. And also Member Morris Hebler just emailed to let us know that she would be joining shortly. But Madam Chair, you do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you, which is a majority of commission. And while there is no action expected today, there would need to be a consensus of those present to create any decision. And as always, even though this is a unique meeting, we do have a few housekeeping announcements. We're going to be listening to primarily public comment. We will start the agenda with a presentation from the Nevada Department of Ed, and then we'll be listening to a public comment actually regarding specifically optimal funding and implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. Members of the public are going to be providing, remember that it's going to be at 3 minutes. So please keep since we have a number of people who have registered or signed up to speak today, we want to make sure that we get all of the voices who have joined us today. So please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. We are going to track that very carefully with the technology that we have to do that. So please be cognizant. If you have longer remarks and you have those in writing, please make sure that you send those to Jessica Todman at jtodman@doe.nv.gov. She will ensure that each of the members receives a copy of your written comments. And so that's important to do, especially if you're unable to cover all of your information inside of the 3 minutes. For everyone today, please remember that to silence all electronic devices. When you're speaking, please mute. When you're not speaking, please mute whatever, your computer, your phone, whatever you're calling in with. And when commenting, make sure you turn your microphone on, state your name, and make sure you turn the microphone and or phone off after each time that you have finished speaking. Please remember for the commission members that we are on video conferences that is live. And finally, we do have a presentation at the very beginning. If we do have any comments, it's actually intended to be more of an update for everyone. By the Nevada Department of Ed, but if you do have any questions or comments, please hold those till the end of the presentation. Jessica, I'm going to double check with you if there's any information for the public comment section that I missed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to note for the record that members Gowdy and McIntosh have joined us, and Senior Deputy Attorney General David Gardner is here as well. And we'll repeat this when we get to the public comment section. We could not say it enough times, but we will unmute you and call on you. If you do want to make a comment, we will ask you to raise your hand at that time. But if you are here and you are just watching, then you are also welcome to do that. And thank you for joining.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, let's go ahead to item number 2 on the agenda. And that is information discussing regarding optimal funding and the implementation and monitoring of the pupil-centered funding plan by the Nevada Department of Education. So, Heidi Hartz, Deputy Superintendent for Nevada Department of Ed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick sound check. I'm going to ask folks who are in our Carson City office to turn the volume off on their computers.
And we can hear you.
Excellent. So for the record, Heidi Hartz, I do serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Business and Support Services at the Department of Education. As you indicated, we are going to begin this afternoon with a high-level overview of the pupil-centered funding plan. And we're going to then show some visuals of the model in action. Do want to note for the benefit of the members of the Commission on School Funding that the information we're sharing today is a version of the model that we presented to you during your October meeting. The dollar values have not changed since that time. So the purpose of the pupil-centered funding plan is to update the funding model used in the state of Nevada for K-12 education. This is significant because it's the first time in 52 years that this model has been updated. And the intent of the update is to add transparency and equity to the way that education is funded within the state of Nevada. I know that folks who have tuned in over the course of the last year, as the Commission on School Funding has done its work, have often struggled to appreciate the transparency and the simplicity of the new model. Certainly the Commission on School Funding has been very thorough in their review of the methodologies and of the model itself, making sure that the model does work in alignment with Senate Bill 543 and also works as intended as a calculation document itself. We have certainly described the work with the Commission on School Funding and the Department of Education over the last year as a process that really is kind of mirrored taking apart a car. So you have all the parts and pieces and can learn how each one works, and then putting the car back together again. And today, we do believe that this is an opportunity to show the public that indeed the car has been taken apart and thoroughly studied and examined and learned about. And it has also been reassembled and is quite capable of taking us down the road into the future and making sure that we are meeting the educational needs of our students throughout our state. I today do want to talk briefly about the state education fund, the education stabilization account, and the 5 tier levels of the pupil-centered funding plan. We do have a handout available with the meeting materials that says pupil-centered funding plan, and it's a visual aid that summarizes how each of these components work together. The state education fund is intended to be the account that receives all of the revenues that will be used to fund K-12 education in the state of Nevada moving forward. It includes both locally generated revenues and revenues that are generated at the statewide level or at a state level. Those funds will then be distributed through the pupil-centered funding plan across 5 tier levels. The first tier level is for the State Board of Education and the Department of Education, is intended for administrative and oversight expenses, as well as for programs that are administered at a state level. Tier B is auxiliary services and would include funding for school districts specific to transportation services and food services. Tier C provides per pupil funding to school districts. Tier D provides per pupil funding to charter schools and the University School for Profoundly Gifted Students. And then Tier E includes weighted funding for specific groups of students that are identified in Senate Bill 543. Those would include at-risk students, gifted and talented students, and English language learners. Senate Bill 543 did include special education services. And the Commission on School Funding has made the recommendation, and our model will reflect that today, that funding for special education be funded outside of the pupil-centered funding plan and continue to be funded in the way that it has been funded in the past several years. There are some activities that fall outside of the pupil-centered funding plan because those activities are not focused on K-12 education. Those would include things such as pre-K, adult education, and continuing education. I would note that adult education and continuing education both have a maintenance of effort requirement, as does special education. Senate Bill 543 does indicate any federal grants that have a state maintenance of effort requirement can be funded and should be funded outside of the pupil-centered funding plan. Another activity that would not be funded through the pupil-centered funding plan would be the Nevada Teach Scholarship Program, because those funds will not be allocated to schools. The Education Stabilization Account has been described as the equivalent of a rainy day fund specifically for education in the state of Nevada. At the end of a fiscal year, if there are unspent funds in the state education fund, those funds would automatically be transferred into the Education Stabilization Account. Senate Bill 543 also includes some provisions or situations under which ending fund balances above a certain threshold for school districts would be transferred into the Education Stabilization Account. The education stabilization account can be used to transfer funds back into the state education fund in the event that revenues fall below 97% of what the legislature has authorized for a specific fiscal year. Before I turn to James to let him demonstrate the pupil-centered funding plan and share portions of the Excel spreadsheets that we use for this process, I do want to give a set of disclaimers as we go through this process. So the information that we are presenting today is the same information that we shared with the Commission on School Funding in October, which was a version of the Department of Education's budget at that point in the budget building process. We certainly do want to acknowledge that the budget is subject to changes as we move from the agency requested phase of the budget building process into the governor's recommended budget and on to the legislatively approved budget. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of the fact that we, the Department of Education, will have several opportunities to revise our enrollment projections throughout the budget building process. So those are subject to change. Similarly, the revenue projections are subject to change moving forward based on the recommendations that are put forward by the Economic Forum, both in December and again in May. With that, I'm going to turn to James and let him take control of the screen and share his Excel spreadsheets.
Deputy Superintendent, are you moving and giving James your physical space, or do I need to get him the baton?
Could you give him the baton? He has the spreadsheet on his computer.
Let's see if I can do it. For some reason, James is not coming up on my presenters list, and I can only hand it to presenters. So my options for folks I believe are in your room is Megan or yourself.
Okay. So if you'll just give us 1 second, I will have James send me his presentation and we will open it up so we can share it. We apologize.
No, that's okay. We're all getting used to the platform, and thank you everyone for your patience.
I think most of that information the commission seen before, but did anybody have any quick questions or anything? I did not. I just want to double check. I don't see anybody looking like, hey, wait a minute, I wanted to ask one question. So all good.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hello, James.
Thank you. Can you see the model up on the screen?
Not yet. So we should have a sharing panel near the top and a big, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. James Kirkpatrick for the record. This is the model we're presenting today is the model for fiscal year 2023. And I'm going to walk through the model and go through various tabs. The first tab I'd like to take you to is the Assumptions tab. This is where the data is input. If you look at the top of the model, in column G, everything kind of aligns. Row 5 is currently set. The current model year being modeled is 2023. The next sets of blocks are related to the funding that was processed through the state education fund in the prior year, less the stabilization account, which is zero, less any accounts for administering federal funds at the state level, which is currently zero, and the net state education fund is the $4 billion in row 10. The next number that I would like to show you is the current year revenue that is being brought into this model as of October that we presented at the last meeting. The next three rows represent the prior year or fiscal year 22 per pupil rate that the model used in the prior year. We brought that in. We added the inflation factor of 0.061%, and the new per pupil rate for fiscal year 23 in this model is identified at $7,226. The next set of blocks represent the CPI, how we determine that inflation factor. We use the CPI seasonally adjusted index for June 20th and the prior year, June 2019. And that gave us our 0.61% inflation factor. The next number I'd like to bring you to, call it row 22. I brought it into this model to demonstrate the 141 million would have been the initial weighted funding from the prior year model. And the next blocks of weighted funding identified is the initial weighted funding for the fiscal year 23. And as you can see, it's broken out by the English language, English learner program amount, the at-risk, and the GATE. And you can see that in fiscal year 23, the initial funding, as identified through our budgeting process, current as of October, currently resides at 143 million, which shows an increase. In column H, represented here, are the targeted weights that were established by the commission earlier this year. And for reference, I brought in the baseline weights from fiscal year 22, or the prior year baseline rates for comparison. Now, I did want to mention that enrollment, we have NDE has projected growth in 21, 22, and 23. The enrollment growth as identified here is 0.19%. So that 0.19%, as we walk through the model, anytime you see enrollment numbers, includes that growth for 23. The next slide I would like to take you to is the State Education Fund. As you can see, column C represents all of the revenue that has been brought into the State Education Fund in this model to flow through the model. What I would like to point out is the revenue identified here are only the revenues that are being targeted towards the tier B, C, D, and E. Revenues not included here would be the state level operating costs for the department, which would be tier A. No federal grant revenue has been identified here, and none of the state revenues that would be used for match or maintenance effort of a federal program. The next schedule I'd like to walk you through is the model cross-check schedule. This schedule really primarily does two main functions. It brings in and accounts for in column D the revenue brought into the model and shows a declining balance as the allocations are allocated by tier level through the waterfall until all of the revenue has been exhausted. Column E in this table also identifies the allocations by the various waterfall or formula tier levels. Column A that's highlighted, again, I would like to emphasize these revenues have not been into the model at this time. We wanted to focus on the revenues flowing through the model directly going to districts and charter schools. Level B, as you can see, there's $209 million there. Those are for the auxiliary services. And if you notice, there are two independent rows for levels C and D. The first row, the $3.5 billion, this is the allocations of the statewide base to the districts and charter schools. The next row for C and D, the 208 million, these are the allocations as allocated through the equity adjustments and would be the adjusted base that is added on top of base. The next row is the tier E, the initial weight. I was trying to highlight the 143 million that was identified in tab 1.1 that we just previously discussed. And that is fully allocated according to this waterfall. And then the next row for tier E, the funding, the revenue that flows through the waterfall beyond the initial weighted funding allocations and goes and becomes the incremental or the funding that is applied towards the targeted weights total. The next tab I would like to walk through is the auxiliary services tab. I would like to point out across the top here in rows 5 and 6, in column C, this amount here, the 4.1 billion, this is the, would be the same amount that is being brought in on the revenue tab 2.1. And as you can see right now, we're going into the top tier and all of that revenue is available. The transportation and food services, the totals here for the district are NDE projections based on a 4-year average of actual costs with an inflationary adjustment added to it. And we also mirror that projection modeling for the food services. And when you combine the two, column I shows the combined total of auxiliary services allocated to the districts. And the cost or total cost is 209, which then moves up into that row 6 allocated amount. That is subtracted from the available, which provides us our remaining dollars that are going to continue to flow through the funding formula. The next tab I would like to bring you to is the statewide base per pupil funding. This tab does assign that 7,226 per pupil rate. It multiplies it out by the total enrollment, and we get the statewide base funding total for each district and each charter school. As you can see in this lower portion. And that total of $3.5 billion is then deducted from the available funding that was brought in from the prior schedule and calculates out a new remaining balance to continue to flow through the funding formula or through the waterfall. The next tab I would like to take you to is the adjusted base funding tab. This tab is a little busier, but the concepts remain the same. Rows 5 and 6 across the top. We've brought in that remaining balance from the prior tab. We have identified a total allocation in for the equity adjustments. And there is an identification of $177 million remaining after the allocation of the equity adjustments that will flow through the waterfall. I wanted to point out that in this tab, there's 4 main sections. The first section is your statewide base per pupil funding amount brought in from the prior tab. The second section is your equity adjustment number 1, or what we call the district size adjustment by attendance area. Originally in Senate Bill 543, for two size adjustments within the bill, a small district and a small school size. Earlier this year, we had subject matters presenting various ways of looking at these equity adjustments, and the commission agreed and approved the use of a single district size adjustment by attendance area. Column J represents those allocations with the total allocation for all districts of $118 million. As we go to the next adjustment, an equity adjustment, also called the Nevada Cost of Education Index. In this adjustment, you'll see that in column 2, there is no adjustment less than 1%. So there was a floor set that basically prevented any negative adjustment being applied to any districts or charter schools. The total for this adjustment is represented in column R. So you could see by district what the Nevada Cost of Education Index is for each district. And you can see a summary of what that adjustment is for the charter schools. And if you scroll down, you can actually see the adjustment applied by charter schools. I also wanted to point out that within SB 543, the bill indicates that a charter school will receive the same cost adjustment factor, or Nevada Cost of Education Index, as the district receives that charter school resides in. And I just have highlighted here that Clark County has an adjustment factor of 1.031, and 100 Academy of Excellence, located in Clark County, receives that same Nevada Cost of Index adjustment. There is also another provision that is identified within this. This is within the schedule that is accounted for. That is the provision that any pupil enrolled full-time in a program of distance education will receive the statewide base. To demonstrate this, I have highlighted here Beacon Academy. They are located in Clark County. However, their student population is based on a distance learning program, and their cost adjustment factor is set at 1, so that school, those students, receive the statewide base per pupil. The final section of this schedule just really summarizes everything, and it adds the base and the district size adjustment and the Nevada Cost of Education adjustment, and gives you a final total. And I wanted to point out that after all of the adjustments are applied, the highest per pupil rate for a district is 20,307 per pupil rate for that district for the adjusted base. Well, the lowest is at $7,446 per pupil, but that still exceeds the original $7,226 per pupil rate at the base level. So within the model, within the schedule, after everything is applied, no district, no charter school will be below the statewide base per pupil funding. They will all be at or above the per pupil funding amount. The next schedule I'd like to take you to is the weighted funding, the initial. Again, I would like to take you to the top. The available funding was the remaining balance brought forward into this schedule from the previous schedule. And the total amount allocated is identified. So this would be allocated within the schedule. And if you remember, early in the walkthrough, tab 1.1, this was what was identified as initial funding for the weighted. So it has fully been allocated with schedule. And we subtract that from the available funding. We have a remaining amount of about $33 million. Within the schedule, again, there's 4 basic sections of the schedule. There's a section for the English learner students, the students, and the gifted and talented students. And basically, this takes the initial allocation, applies the per pupil rate, and allocates the funding for each group of students. When you add the allocations up, they come up to the allocated amount of 143, and that is demonstrated in this 4th column Y, in this 4th section of the schedule. Summarizes the allocations for all 3 student populations and brings that up into L6 and identifies the allocations. If you scroll down into the lower sections, you will see the same allocation methodology for the chart. I would like to take you to the weighted funding incremental schedule. This is where, obviously, coming up back up to the top, we're following the sequence of the funding through the formula or through the waterfall. And we have brought it forward, that $33 million from the previous schedule, and we have allocated that. This schedule, again, is kind of broken up into 3 primary areas. Again, the areas are around the English learner student population, the at-risk student population, and the gifted and talented population. Within each one of these groups, we have brought in the enrollment. We have brought in the initial weighted factors. We have identified the differential factors within this. And based on that, based on the total amount of allocation, we have proportionately allocated an amount for each student population group to use up that $33 million. Column Z represents the current allocation for the English learner student population. Column AN identifies the allocated amount for the at-risk student population. Column BB, again, identifies the allocations, proportional allocations for the gifted and talented student population. And right here, I've just summarized the 3 different sections. So after allocated, we've identified that $33 million, which was brought back to the schedule and subtracted out and zeroed out the remaining funds flowing through the model. The next schedule I would like to take you to is the hold harmless calculation schedule. This schedule at a high level looks at what was allocated within the formula, within this model, and compares it to the hold harmless. Column B identifies what was allocated in the model to each district. Column D identifies the hold harmless amounts.
The majority
for
of the
each
money.
district
Yeah, crazy.
based on the budgets, the fiscal year 20 budgets, the amended budgets that were submitted last December to the Department of
Look
Education.
at that. The amount that the
Column F
proceeds.
just simply asks that question. Is
No.
the current year allocation less than the hold harmless? And it responds appropriately. Column H identifies the net proceeds of each district so that we know that these monies are the first monies in to fund these districts.
Look at that.
Column N and P,
Nothing. For Clark County.
those columns
Look at all that.
are identifying which districts are below
Look.
the hold harmless
Districts
and which
above the
districts
hold harmless.
fall above the hold harmless.
Well, Clark County's the whole
Column
money.
T and V,
Nothing. Whole V says
they
something.
identify the adjustments needed.
Mhm.
Column T identifies the adjustments needed to bring districts up to the hold harmless amount.
Just a joke, right?
And column V identifies the proportional adjustments required to bring those districts up to the hold harmless. Column X represents the final adjustment for the districts and the amount allocated to those districts after the hold harmless adjustment has occurred. I would like to identify the Humboldt County School District. They were a district that fell below the hold harmless. And when we come across after the adjustment, they were brought up to be equal with the hold harmless under this adjustment. I would also like to identify White Pine County school district was allocated more than their hold harmless amount. And when you follow this line across, they received a proportional adjustment to contribute to the districts that needed help to be brought up to the hold harmless. But even after the adjustment, the district still is receiving a greater amount of funding than their hold harmless. The next schedule I'd like to take you to is an output schedule. And this just summarizes kind of the waterfall one more time, kind of looking at it a little differently than that model cross-check schedule. It just, in column E, really emphasizes and identifies again, in this model, the state oversight administration. We didn't have any of those revenues brought into this model being demonstrated, so there's
Mhm.
0 there. The 209 that was allocated in level B of the waterfall is identified. And then we have the 3.7 total adjusted base that was allocated, and it was broken out in 3.5 from the statewide base per pupil, and each adjustment added on top of that. And then again in the funding level E, again, we have the breakdown of the detail of each student population, the English learner at risk and gifted and talented receiving their allocations
Mhm.
with a total allocation greater than the 143 we started with. So we are showing incremental progress in
Mhm.
meeting that targeted total rate.
So thank you, James, for walking everyone through the model. Hopefully folks are recognizing that it is getting more transparent than perhaps was at previous meetings when we were doing a really deep dive on the various components of the model. I do want to remind everyone that Senate Bill 543 does indicate the legislature's intent that no school district would receive less funding through the People-Centered Funding Plan than they received in fiscal year 2020. So we are currently reviewing the financial information for fiscal year 2020 that was submitted by each school district. As soon as those numbers are finalized, we will update the hold harmless amount for each school district. That may have an impact on which school districts would fall below the hold harmless amount or above the hold harmless amount using the People-Centered Funding Plan model. The Commission on School Funding has also been working in the last several months to discuss optimal funding, which is one of its tasks as identified in Bill 543. So the Commission has worked on a vision statement for what optimal funding should look like and what the state should be striving for. At the last meeting, the Commission identified the importance of making sure that current funding is maintained. That would be current funding prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting budgetary impacts that have been experienced. Then moving towards adequate funding and ultimately on to optimal funding. So in the coming months, the Commission will continue to identify what optimal funding looks like more specifically so that costs can be attributed to those activities or services. And then the Commission on School Funding can continue to identify what possible revenue sources might look like in order to help the state move towards optimal funding. Madam Chair, that concludes our presentation for today. And I would just ask before we move forward, if the Commission members have anything that they either need clarified or they think that we left out of they want to make sure we note before moving on with the agenda.
Let me do a check. Member Fueling.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Senate Bill 543, when looking at the hold harmless provision, it specifically says it's based on the funds received in fiscal year 20. And given what happened last year, and specifically at kind of crunch time as things were happening, and a lot of districts identified state grant dollars that they could remit back to SARE, they knew they wouldn't use. But those were dollars that were expected to be used, I guess, or were awarded. And so I was wondering how, if how that's playing into the equation at all, because on those 387 reports, it's going to only reflect the dollars that were spent and not the dollars that were awarded.
Heidi Hartz for the record. That is something that the department hopes that we can look at once the final data is available in the 387 reports. Certainly last spring when the governor asked state agencies to identify budget savings that could be utilized to help the state out of a financial crisis, our school districts were incredibly generous in identifying where revisions or reductions could be made, particularly in our state funded grants. We also did notice at the end of the fiscal year when we were truing up the DSA payments, that there are some revenues that the state guarantees at the local level. And if those revenues are not earned as projected, the state backfills those with general fund dollars. So the department will do an analysis to see how that played into the hold harmless amount for each school district. Certainly these are unprecedented times, and that information I believe will be very helpful to our decision makers as we move forward.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, great. Seeing no other questions, once again, thank you for the overview. Thank you to Heidi and to James from the Nevada Department of Ed for walking us through some of the highlights of the pupil-centered funding plan, as well as some of the processes that are entailed in the actual calculations. So that was good for all of us to be able to, those of us that have seen it before, it's good for us as a reminder on how all those work and the impact of those dollars. With that, part of the important piece of this work, this is actually the second to last year around this time, we had a meeting dedicated to public comment because it's important that we hear from folks and their opinions, and we specifically wanted them to focus on optimal funding since that is part of the task of the commission, as Heidi noted. Identifying optimal funding, the cost of optimal funding, and then also indicated within SB 543 is potential strategies or methods for funding optimal funding over the course of 10 years. So we're hoping that we are going to hear from public, during public comment, some thoughts or ideas regarding that. And then I also am looking forward to implementation. Thoughts on implementation, those are important because things about an implementation, monitoring, and how school districts might especially be rethinking how they are going to, with increased flexibility and transparency of the pupil-centered funding plan, what they might change in terms of, or need in terms of implementation. So with that, I am going to turn over the controls to Jessica Todman to be able to turn on and off various. Again, just as a reminder, please hold as you can with one or two exceptions potentially to the 3 minutes. We are going to be tracking that. So thank you. Jessica?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we noted earlier, but I'm pleased to remind everybody, we will begin by recognizing attendees who wish to comment if you use the raise hand function on the panel, the control panel. If you have any issues and you want to raise your hand without using that, you can email me. My email address is in the chat, or you can text me. My phone number is 702-757-7203. We are very committed to making sure that everybody who wants to be heard will be heard today. And I ask that if you do have your testimony in writing, that you email it to me after it's been delivered so we can make sure it is complete and accurate in the record. And I do want to finally note before we go to comments, I will start with Mr. Daly, that Member Morris Hibbler has joined us for the record. So with that, again, you can email or text me any questions, and we're going to begin comment. As the chair noted, I will be timing you for 3 minutes. We'll give you a warning, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to unmute Mr. Chris Daly. You are unmuted.
Thank you, Jessica. Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association. Listen to educators. Educators do not feel heard, and that's because decision makers just have not been listening. Listen to educators. When SB 543 was first introduced on May 13th, 2019, on the 99th day of the legislative session, NSEA issued a statement of opposition. It began with a quote from Ruben Murillo, a special education teacher and then president of NSEA. He said, quote, NSEA is very disappointed with this proposal. NSEA and other important education stakeholders have been shut out of this process since November. Senator Dennis's unwillingness to collaborate with educators on this important issue is evident in his proposed plan. To introduce this massive overhaul of the funding formula on the 99th day of session is irresponsible and speaks to the poor process, end quote. Listen to educators. NSEA's statement highlighted policy concerns with the new funding plan. All the same concerns you've heard us repeat at every meeting of this commission since last September. But NSEA's overarching concern is simply restated. Any new funding plan for Nevada schools needs to include new funding to be successful. Listen to educators. When the legislature passed SB 543 in 2019, no one could have foreseen the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic crisis hitting hardest here in Nevada. The unfortunate new reality is Nevada is falling further away from optimal funding for K-12 education. $156 million in painful cuts were made to K-12 education this summer, including total elimination of weighted funding for at-risk students and English learners, the very basis for the new funding formula. And with COVID-19 cases hitting record highs this week, the crisis and the related economic impacts are far from over. We know the governor has requested 12% reduction proposals from all departments, including MPE, for the next biennium. This means the new funding plan will contain draconian cuts to our classrooms, further devastating students and educators. In other words, SB 543 will cut school funding. This is not acceptable. Now educators are again calling on this commission, the legislature, and the governor to please do no harm and delay the implementation of SB 543 until after the pandemic. Please listen to educators. Delay the new funding plan and work with us. Develop a revenue plan to get us out of the current economic crisis and on our way to optimal funding. Thank you.
Perfect timing as always. We're going to go next to Mr. Valadita. Give me 1 moment to get you unmuted. Mr. Valadita, you are unmuted.
Thank you, members of the commission. My name is John Valadita. I'm with the Clark County Education Association, representing over 18,000 educators in the state, the largest amount of teachers in Nevada. I want to address 3 things: optimal funding and implementation timeline, recommended revenue stream in my remarks. So on optimal funding, we think it should be defined as meeting student performance outcomes to improve Nevada's education delivery system. This approach would focus on raising Nevada's K-12 education system from, say, the bottom in the nation to mid-range nationally in math, science, and reading. The most recent APA study can be used to help guide the Commission's recommendations in determining the cost of meeting performance outcomes. That study identified what resources are needed to hit key academic outcomes. On the implementation timeline, we advocate that the effective implementation date of the new plan should begin in the 21-22 school year, have a 10-year timeline as outlined under the legislation. However, we would recommend that the Commission place great emphasis on adopting an aggressive funding level for the first 6 years of the plan, with emphasis on building up the per pupil baseline funding level. That means the next 3 legislative sessions will prioritize building the baseline funding level with adequate appropriations. Now on the recommended revenue stream. We believe it's essential to fully fund the new formula with a dedicated and stable source of revenue. At the September 25th Commission meeting, CCA presented to you an analysis of Nevada's property tax system that we commissioned the Gwynn Center to perform. We believe that the Commission should consider recommending to the legislature that property tax be the primary source of funding for the new plan, since schools are the largest beneficiary of property tax dollars. In 2019, a study commissioned by Nevada's Legislative Council Bureau on revenue impacts of the SJR 14 determined that allowing property tax depreciation factor to reset on the sale of property, for example, would generate an additional $13.2 billion in property taxes statewide over the first 12 years of implementation. The 12-year economic impact for Clark County schools was alone estimated at $4.6 billion. We believe this revenue stream is a stream that would fully fund the base and the weights. In conclusion, we recommend that optimal funding be tied to performance outcomes from student achievements, that a timeline of implementation that invests heavily in the first 6 years to raise the per pupil baseline funding be adopted, and that property taxes become a dedicated and stable source of revenue for the new plan. CCA supports the work of the commission moving forward with recommendations. We are adamantly opposed to putting on hold the implementation of SB 543 as outlined in the legislation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Balajuda. In case anybody is overly concerned with me, I am squinting a lot because I am hard of vision, not because I'm responding to anybody's comments. I just thought it was worth making that clear. Next, we have Mr. Alexander Marks. And Mr. Marks, you are self-muted, but I believe I have unmuted you. There you go.
Are we good?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Alexander Marks with the Nevada State Education Association. Again, because this meeting is held during contract hours for many of our members, I'm going to read a few portions of letters that were submitted to you. I know you've received hundreds. I would encourage you to read them all so that we listen to educators. From a teacher in Washoe, please help. COVID-19 pandemic exposed how terribly underfunded our schools are. I'm a 4th grade teacher at Pleasant Valley Elementary. I can't do more with less. Right now, 5 classrooms in our building are sharing 1 iPad cart that our PTA purchased several years ago. My students have 2 devices on Tuesdays, and that's it. We are not able to use our computer lab because my number of students is over 50% capacity per the rules per Governor Sisolak. We cannot afford more cuts. From an education support professional in Clark County, I'm a school bus driver. My concern over possible cuts are with regard to the safe transportation of our students. Cutting funds to education ultimately will affect the transporting of my students. We barely have supplies to clean and sanitize our buses as it is. We are short on drivers, and any cuts to funding will impact the district's ability to hire qualified bus drivers. From another educator in Nevada, as Nevada educators, we know how hard it is to provide a high-quality education in a system that is chronically underfunded. That's why any new funding plan for Nevada schools needs to include new funding to be successful. My colleagues and I are appalled that a plan will cut education for our schools and that it's even being discussed at this point. I've taught in Nevada for over 13 years, both in rural and urban settings. Despite the lack of funding, I'm amazed at the quality of education our students receive because of our hardworking teachers and education support professionals. I'm less impressed by politicians and appointed officials who think that it's okay that education is so underfunded. As our state economy diversifies and changes, it is your job to find ways to increase that education budget and so that we can recruit highly qualified teachers to our state and give the resources to current teachers and keep them in our profession. If you are unable to do so, you have no other choice but to delay this plan. You will hear from several educators after me who will tell you the same. Will you ignore us, or will you finally listen to educators? So in closing, as you can see, teachers, these are just a couple samples we have. They know what this plan will do. They're in the classrooms. Public education does not work in spreadsheets. A funding plan with no new revenue or new funding is unworkable. It's unworkable with the additional cuts from last summer. It'll be unworkable with the additional 12% proposed by the governor. Those cuts are just numbers on your spreadsheet, but those cuts have real school site implications and exacerbate the issues in these stories contained in the emails that you have received over this last week, and quite frankly, we've been telling you about for the last year. Please listen to educators, do no harm, delay the implementation of SB 543. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Next, we have Ms. Sylvia Lazos. Ms. Lazos, I am unmuting you, and it appears you are self-muted. You're unmuted now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, commission members. Sylvia Lossos, I'm recommended. I am representing the Nevada Immigrant Coalition. These are parents and the workers who have been hit the hardest by unemployment and by COVID in Southern Nevada. As I sit here and testify today, many state workers have already received notice of furloughs for 2021, representing pay cuts of the rate in the range of 10 to 15%. And as many of you know, the unemployment rate for September 2020 for Nevada was 12.6%. Only Hawaii's unemployment rate was worse. On November 10, the Economic Forum reported that they expected the Nevada economy to recover 2 years from now. Our parents are scared. Our parents are strapped with this economy. And for this reason, we don't believe it makes any sense to implement SB 543 in the next biennium. 543 should be implemented when the economy recovers and when the revenue recommendations that this commission makes, we can implement them. The two go hand in hand, a robust school finance scheme and a robust revenue scheme. So without one, we are doomed to failure. On the issue of weights, the discussion from last week was very much on point. We cannot cannibalize the general education budget by not adequately funding special education needs. That remains a giant hole in SB 543. And the adjustments recommended by this commission should fully fund special ed in order that general education and special ed kids are not pitted one against the other. We continue to strongly recommend to you to make allowances or adjustments to keep and grandfather Zoom and Victory programs. The current definition of at-risk does not take into consideration geography. Poverty, racial segregation is geographic. When I ask my students in my classes, point to the areas in Nevada that are the poorest and the most likely to be unable to get to the middle class, they know exactly where they are. It is these areas that Zoom and Victory programs have been able to successfully help and to get the schools in these areas on the road to be able to provide these children an adequate education. It does not make sense to tear down what has been achieved in order to have an equality-based per pupil formula instead of an equity-based per pupil formula.
Ms. Lazarus, we're at time, so if you could wrap up.
Thank you, ma'am. Finally, on optimal funding, it is a complex subject, but we recommend that you think about it from a legal perspective. Optimal funding should be that funding which is sufficient, which is what the Nevada Constitution requires to meet all of the standards that have been set by the State Board of Education and the legislature. Current funding does not support the work of school districts to reach what the legal requirements of the State Board of Education require school districts to do. So that would be a very simple approach to optimal funding. Thank you very much for listening to my comments.
Thank you. For our next public comment, we're going to go to Ms. Lindsay Anderson. And give me a moment as I scroll down my list. I can unmute you.
Thank you. Lindsay Anderson on behalf of Dr. Kristen McNeil, the superintendent for the Washoe County School District. First, I want to recognize all the hard work and thought that the Nevada Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding have put into the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan since September of last year. As we know, the pupil-centered funding plan is a completely new model for funding in K-12 education in Nevada and has required great thought in terms of first defining issues and terms and then working through the various accounting, budgeting, planning, and programming issues that will arise when planning for the implementation of this new model in less than 2 years. While recognizing this important and good work that has been done, the Washoe County School District still has several serious concerns which cause us to hesitate fully endorsing the commission's decisions. First, our district continues to question the regional cost adjustment factor that does not reflect what we see in reality in Washoe County as it relates to housing costs, labor costs, and the availability of skilled labor, and general inflationary pressures that result from a growing county population. I don't think anyone questions that Washoe County has the highest costs of living among major counties in the state, and yet we are penalized under the current calculation and shown having one of the lowest cost adjustment factors in the state. Any funding model that starts with this calculation will immediately have its credibility questioned. We believe it's important for the model to help address the critical issue of supporting a livable wage for our teachers, and this model goes backwards in addressing this issue in Washoe. We ask that you reconsider and set the regional cost adjustment at 1.0 across all districts until such time as the commission has access to regional data that reflects reality. Secondly, the Washoe County School District understands the commission's recommendations to remove special education from the formula and account for it separately due to maintenance of effort concerns. However, we urge the commission to ensure that special education weights are included in the distribution of new funds at the state level. Special education is significantly underfunded at the federal and state level. Based on the adopted IEP, individual education plans of our students, the district has to shift its general fund or base dollars, which should be used to support all students, to cover the shortfall in federal and state funding for special education. Last year, our general fund had to cover $46 million of special education costs compared to $32.6 million in state funding. The burden on districts to cover this shortfall has got to be shifted to the state's formula in recognition of the fact that districts do not have the option to reduce spending on students with IEPs. Similarly, Washoe County School District has felt compelled to supplement state funding of programs for English learners, GATE programs, and at-risk students with our own funds due to the inadequacy of funding from the state. The convergence of dramatically reduced revenues due to the recession, the significant decrease in enrollment because of pandemic-related family choices, and the potential to be held at FY20 funding levels due to the hold harmless provisions in the new funding plan leaves Washoe County School District looking at a frightening fiscal situation next biennium. We understand that the level of funding for K-12 education is separate from the construction and implementation of the new funding model, and yet we remain concerned by several key features of the pupil-centered funding plan. We need to see decisions of the state this coming legislative session that demonstrates its commitment to K-12 education by starting to fully fund the base rates and creating a plan to achieve optimal funding. Our students deserve this commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Ruby Caliendo. I am going to unmute you. You are unmuted.
Thank you, ma'am. And first off, I am a teacher here in Clark County, and I want to say thank you to all of you because this is a very difficult topic to tackle in such the short amount of time that you guys have been given to come up with the plan. However, as a CC teacher, I teach regular students and special education students in a regular ed setting as the actual science teacher. And I have seen over the last few years more and more programs go by the wayside due to lack of funding. I also teach very high-risk students because at Chaparral, we are considered an inner city school due to our economic status of the majority of our students. This is very, very problematic for schools like mine to cut this much funding and not to have a stable funding formula in this state has always ranked Nevada in the bottom for the United States. I would really like to see this program delayed until a lot more work can go into it and that the state at the legislature level can find a stable and forever funding source instead of using just the base funds from the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Jeff Zander. Mr. Zander will be speaking on behalf of 6 school districts, and so the chair has acknowledged to give him a little bit of overage of time. Mr. Zander, you're unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Madam Chair and the esteemed members of this commission, thank you for your hard work and for being part of this commission and volunteering your time for Nevada students. I understand the difficulty of your assignment and appreciate you taking time to listen to and consider the input of the community and the experts as part of your decision-making process. As you know, I am the former superintendent of Elko County. As you may know, I am the former superintendent of the Elko County School District. I come to you not only as a former administrator, but as a native Nevadan representing the best interests of students of Nevada. As someone who cares about our students, it has been disheartening to hear public comment and commission member discussions that pit one group of students against another and label some as winners and some as losers. It is not my intent to continue down that path. As I just stated, I'm a strong advocate for the students of Nevada, and as such, I'm primarily concerned with creating a plan that helps all students. I understand the strong support of the students within your own communities, just as I want to see the students in my community succeed and thrive. I understand that everyone who sits on this commission feels the same relative to their own communities. However, it is imperative that the plan that is implemented must be functional for all the educational communities throughout Nevada, not just within our own community. As this commission has time and again addressed, education in Nevada is in a difficult spot. Nevada schools have not been funded adequately throughout my 32 tenure, and that we can agree. But to redistribute resources by taking from one group of kids to benefit another is not acceptable. It is unconscionable to take from rural students and school districts who already do not have the same access to AP courses or no elective offerings to learn a trade such as fashion graphic design, culinary arts, and many of the other programs offered at urban magnet and CTE schools. I hear often from our pupils that they wish they had some of the same opportunities as kids in urban districts. The answer cannot be to create a plan that would reduce or siphon funding from any school district in Nevada. Under the current PCFP computation, many districts would be subjected to the reduced funding and a hold harmless that basically erodes purchasing power over time. If we're embarking on a new and improved funding formula, why do we even need a hold harmless provision? Why accept a proposal that does any harm to any student or school district? How is accepting inadequate funding for some the new Nevada? In the latest iteration of the PCFP that has been shared with the commission, several school districts are going to be subjected to the hold harmless clause that does not effectively hold them harmless. In other words, the PCFP returns an amount less than what is currently received. As stated above, we all understand no district was adequately funded prior to the development of the PCFP. With that in mind, it begs the question, are there cost factors that are not being properly accounted for in these negatively affected counties? I believe the answer lies somewhere in the combination of cost factors and base funding allocations. In the PCFP, all districts are being allocated an average salary and benefit costs. In a Nevada plan, those costs were grouped and averaged by district size and configuration. This structure provided enhanced fiscal neutrality. The PCFP distribution is having an adverse effect on those districts with higher salary and benefit costs. These higher costs could be the result of more lucrative individual salary schedules due to the higher cost to recruit and retain staff. It could also be the result of a more veteran district staff and their respective placement on the salary schedules. Another concern with the implementation of this plan is that Nevada is a collective bargaining state, and as an unfortunate result, employees have property interest rights in their salary and benefit packages. Thus, districts that are frozen at the hold harmless amount will have no ability to reduce salary and benefit levels for most of their staff. This would restrict their ability to build cost savings through salary and benefit level adjustments and most likely result in significant reductions in staff through RIF protocols. Decreased educational programming is also a likely byproduct. In my analysis, it is difficult to determine exactly what is creating these adverse distributions. In some districts, it appears to reflect density or scale issues, salary and benefit adjustment issues as described above, regional cost adjustment issues, or possibly a combination of all three. If the adjustments do not accurately reflect the costs necessary to recruit and retain staff in every county, then inequity is inherent within the PCFP. The intent of an equitable distribution of resources is to provide teachers of similar quality to students no matter where they attend. In addition to updating the current funding formula, the PCFP implements weighted funding for special education, at-risk, ELL, and GATE programming. Why are these PCFP weights not adjusted by the same cost factors that adjust base funding? Is the cost of delivery of this program the same in every district in Nevada?
No.
Of course not, and ignoring that fact will lead to more inequity in the PCFP.
Mm-hmm.
I know this commission is made up of good people. No one here wants to benefit one group of kids to the detriment of another.
But
Let's
they've
not
done it
allow
all
that
along.
to happen. You are appointed to analyze, plan, make recommendations, and propose solutions. Please recommend that we support all students and propose an equitable distribution that is funded with the resources necessary to provide a stable, adequate, supportive school environment for years to come. I strongly believe this commission and the students under the peace. I strongly believe this commission and the legislature require additional time and analysis to ensure the ultimate success of all students under the PCFP. Rushing into a radical overhaul of such a complex system will practically guarantee that Nevada's children are denied equal educational opportunities. This is especially true during these difficult and unpredictable times in which we are currently living. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zender. Could you identify the districts that you're representing, please?
So Elko, Eureka, Story, Douglas, Lyon, and Lincoln.
Thank you very much. Next, I'll go to Ms. Rebecca Garcia. Ms. Garcia, I have unmuted you. You are self-muted, and we should be able to hear you now. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Garcia, and I'm the president of the Nevada Parent Teacher Association. Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment today. We appreciate the efforts of this commission and the time to give feedback. I appreciate the depth and diversity of experience each of you bring to this important work. While much of this work is highly technical in nature, for me, the importance of this work directly relates to the needs of my own children and all children in our state. A new equitable funding formula is an essential step in improving education funding in Nevada. Optimum funding should reflect the actual needs of all students across our state and the cost to provide resources necessary for students to meet standards. It is well documented that our current education funding is suboptimal and does not provide the resources necessary for all students to succeed. Optimal funding must recognize the current realities, what our students in every district across the state need to thrive, and should not simply be optimizing existing inadequate funding. We urge the commission to finalize recommendations with funding goals that restore K-12 cuts and provide at minimum adequate funding as recommended by recent APA studies. It is also essential that the commission develop and propose a plan to raise the revenue needed to meet these goals. We know additional revenue is needed to meet optimal funding goals, and the success of the new funding formula requires additional revenue. Recommendations are needed for the legislative session so that progress can be made in implementing the new funding formula. We all recognize that Nevada is in a particularly challenging time, but the needs of Nevada's children remain constant. Our children, even in challenging times, do not stop growing, and their need for additional appropriate resources to receive an education continue even in challenging times. Legislative policy is often a slow process, but as you consider education funding, I would remind you to recognize what a short time frame there is to impact the life of a child. My youngest was 8 years old and in the second grade when 543 was passed. In 2023, she will be starting middle school. In 10 years, she will be 19 and in college. All students require resources now to receive the education that they receive, and we must recognize across our state how we can best get these resources to kids now before they're in college. Thanks for your time and consideration.
Grazie, grazie.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. We now have Ryan Russell under the name Jennifer McMenemy. I'm going to unmute you, Mr. Russell. Should we get to go?
Yeah. Good afternoon, folks. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Yeah. All right. as Jessica noted, my name is Ryan Russell. I'm an attorney with the Allison McKinsey Law Firm in Carson City, speaking here today on behalf of the majority of school districts in the state of Nevada, 10 of them. Elko, Eureka, Story, Douglas, Pershing, Lander, Lyon, Esmeralda, Lincoln, and Carson City. And we provided you at basically every meeting you guys have had with our written comments, which you've graciously read into public comment. We've also sent you those written comments. And I will try to spare you regurgitating them today, and I'm going to try not to be repetitive. Suffice to say that the counties I represent are all unified in their request that the implementation of SB 543 be delayed. I support in particular the comments made by Mr. Zander today, as well as those made by Washoe County, because I believe they were astute. What we heard today, even in the presentation, is that the hold harmless provision is still lacking sufficient data to be properly funded. We're on the eve of entering the next legislative session with a key component still uncertain. And that fact is made especially clear, or especially poignant, by the pandemic that we're all in. It was mentioned earlier that when this legislation was passed, they could not have foreseen the pandemic or the impact it would have on the budgets of each school district in the state. And we know across the board those impacts have been severe. With those severe impacts being suffered right now, implementing this bill or this funding plan would be done in a time when we're also being called to further cut the budget by at least 12%. I urge you to consider that this is bad timing to roll out a new funding plan. It needs more time to be properly vetted through the good efforts of this commission and hopefully through collaborative efforts with the counties and the school districts that it will affect. And so I repeat our request that you strongly consider delaying implementation of SB 543. To revert back to Ms. Hart's analogy of rebuilding a car, I assure you, you would not take that car on the road if there was a danger of it causing injury to somebody. And as this plan is written right now, it has the possibility to directly harm the rural counties, and including those that I represent. So again, I request that you please delay implementation, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I do not have any further hands raised. I do not want to assume that means that no one else wishes to comment. Thank you. Amanda Morgan, I'm going to unmute you. You are unmuted. You need to unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. My name is Amanda Morgan with Educate Nevada Now. Thank you for your hard work and dedication to Nevada students and the opportunity to address you today. PNN is encouraged by the work of the Commission in developing optimal funding targets. We understand Commission members seek to develop benchmarks to achieve optimal funding, including restoring lost funding, achieving adequate funding levels per APA's recommendations, and determining an optimal funding level beyond adequacy. We look forward to seeing how optimal funding is defined, but are glad to see you have established benchmarks which include restoration of funds and adequacy per APA. With the prospect of even more K-12 funding cuts, discussion of potential new revenue, and the reality of biennium sessions, we appreciate that the Commission will be in a position to develop timely recommendations for the first two benchmarks. Further, we highly recommend the Commission make revenue recommendations prior to this upcoming legislative session, so we can begin the urgent work now versus waiting until 2023. We believe developing optimal funding targets beyond adequacy will take a great deal of time and potentially require an additional study. And this work will carry the Commission well into next year or even longer. However, the Commission has the first two benchmarks established and is able to make revenue recommendations to meet them. Our students deserve an immediate plan of action instead of prolonged conversations, and we are encouraged that the Commission is in a place to provide that for them. Again, thank you for your thoughtful deliberations and work on behalf of Nevada students.
Thank you. For a second, I lost my own unmute button. We have Ms. Darlene Anderson. Ms. Anderson, I've unmuted you. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, my question is about the children who are below proficient and who are far, far below basic. I have not found a maintenance of effort for the work that's being done for those children who are failing simply because the disaggregated data for African American children really all fall under the behavioral access. And once a child is in a behavioral program, there's really no requirement that I see for the academic support to continue. And so those children are being geared towards a second class education as far as I'm concerned, but I don't see how they're included in this model. Thank you.
Thank you. We have somebody who is unmuted, so please check yourselves. Next, we have Ms. Susan Kaiser. And I will unmute you. And if you unmute yourself, you should be able to be heard.
Okay. Thank you. I'm learning this program. Good afternoon to the chair and members of the Commission on School Funding. For the record, my name is Susan Kaiser. I'm president of the Washoe Retired Education Association, and I'm speaking with the approval of my board of directors on the topic of SB 543. I'm a national board certified science teacher, now retired after 25 years of service to Nevada students in public school. When I left the classroom in June of 2019, my colleagues and I were still spending hours of our personal time to create learning tools and writing grants to obtain the basic curriculum materials needed to teach our students. We worked hard to fill the gaps in students' access to technology by sharing computer cards on a rotation, which meant my students could use visual learning resources 2 times every quarter. For decades, we tried to educate our students on a shoestring budget, and we were even able to show some improvement in spite of chronic underfunding. However, with the lasting impact of the pandemic, these perennial funding challenges are now magnified for every public school educator. SB 543 was rushed in the last minute of the 2019 legislative session without hearing the voices of educators and education stakeholders who called for a new revenue source. A classroom educator can be the eyes and ears of elected officials. Our experiences in the classroom can illuminate and guide you in understanding the impacts of funding shortfalls on individual students. For example, some of us are distributing dog-eared and worn-out textbooks that are 20 years old to our students. Some of us problem solve to create ways to allow all children access to 21st century learning tools like computers and tablets, no matter which zip code their school is zoned in. Some of us are uniquely trained to teach special needs students. We provide individual education plans that may include services from other specialists or specialized learning devices, which assist the students in their future success as adults. Sadly, some of us are there to report abuse and neglect when it happens at home. As one can imagine, there is a positive impact to the coronavirus pandemic. It is the undeniable value of trained professional educators in our public schools as a critical component in the daily life of America's kids, families, and communities. The contributions of educators in our public schools is crystal clear, but all of these services require money. When educators tell you they need training and funding for these tools, it is because they need these items to benefit Nevada's kids and increase their chances of future flourishing. I respectfully submit that this is not the time to further cut funding to Nevada's public schools. In fact, it is the time to listen to the voice of educators and find additional revenue sources, perhaps through reevaluating the allocations of monies to the unaccountable charter schools, and at the very least to delay the implementation of SB 543. Thank you for your time and your work.
Thank you. Once again, I have no additional hands raised, so I will give us a moment for anyone else to identify themselves. Again, if you're having any issues with the technology, you're welcome to email me. My email is on the agenda and in our chat, or you can text or call me at 702-757-7203. You know what, Madam Chair, would you mind if we take a convenience break of 5 minutes just to give people a chance to do that? we cannot hear you, but it looks like you're agreeing and telling me that that's a great idea. Okay.
You know, it's that ever-present mute button. What can I tell you? So yes, I have it at 4:05 right now. So let's go ahead and come back at 4:15 and take any other comments. I do want to thank everybody for taking the time so far that have joined us. Very interesting perspectives and valuable information for us to consider as we move forward. So thank you. All right, take a break and we'll all be back in 10. Remember to stop sharing your screen unless you're going to sit there and write an